March 1945, Western Germany. American tanks were ready to enter a small town until the soldiers saw families standing directly in their path. Behind those civilians, German troops were waiting with weapons. The Nazi commander believed Patton's men would not dare fire, but he had made one serious mistake. He thought human shields could stop George S. Patton. The exact details of this account are difficult to confirm, but it reflects a very real pattern from the final months of Nazi Germany. Desperate commanders putting civilians in danger to delay Allied troops. By this point, the Third Reich was collapsing. American forces were pushing from the west. The Soviet army was closing in from the east. German towns were falling one after another, but some Nazi commanders still refused to surrender, even when the war was already lost. The American column moved carefully toward the town. The soldiers expected danger. They expected mines under the road, machine guns in windows, snipers in church towers, and anti-tank guns hidden behind stone walls. The streets ahead looked quiet, but in Germany in 1945, quiet did not mean safe. Then the lead vehicles slowed. There were civilians in the road. A mother pulled a child close against her coat. An old man stood with empty hands half raised. A few women stayed near the roadside, frozen between the American tanks in front of them and the German troops behind them. Nobody moved with confidence. Nobody looked free. These people were trapped. At first, the American soldiers could not understand what they were seeing. Civilians were supposed to be behind the lines, hiding or fleeing from the fighting. But these civilians were standing exactly where the battle would begin. Then the trap became clear. Behind them, German soldiers had taken positions. Some were inside houses, some were near windows. Others were hidden behind walls deeper in the town. The civilians were not just caught in the middle by accident. They had been placed in the danger zone. For a few seconds, the American advance stopped. That was exactly what the Nazi commander wanted. If the Americans fired too quickly, innocent people could die. If they waited too long, German weapons could kill American soldiers. The commander had turned mercy into a weapon. He was betting that Patton's men would hesitate, and that hesitation would buy him time. One American soldier lowered his rifle when he saw the child near the road. Another shouted for the civilians to get down, but most of them did not move. Maybe they were too afraid. Maybe they had been ordered to stay where they were. Maybe they knew that running could get them shot from behind. The tank engines rumbled. The infantry waited. Officers looked toward the town, trying to read every window and doorway. Somewhere behind those civilians, German guns were ready. The message moved back through the column. German troops were using civilians as cover. When word reached Patton's command, the situation was exactly the kind of battlefield trick he hated: delay, fear, and civilians used as tools. Patton was known for speed and pressure, but this was not a moment for blind force. This was a moment for control. The answer had to be clear. Separate the civilians, keep pressure on the German position, and do not let the commander use innocent people to freeze the advance. The tanks could not simply blast through the town. That would only complete the commander's cruel plan. Infantry had to do the dangerous work up close. They had to move carefully, find the German positions, and create a path for the civilians to escape the line of fire. So the Americans began moving forward, not in a wild charge, not with careless shooting, step by step. Soldiers spread along walls, fences, and ditches. Rifles were raised but controlled. Every window could hide a sniper. Every doorway could become a death trap. A tank rolled forward slowly, its gun watching the buildings, but waiting for a clear target. An American soldier shouted again for the civilians to get down. Another waved them toward cover. A woman grabbed her child and crouched near the edge of the road. The old man stumbled as he tried to move away from the open street. Then the first shots cracked from inside the town. The civilians screamed and dropped low. The Americans hit the ground. German fire was coming from behind the civilians, exactly where the soldiers had suspected. Now the trap was fully exposed. The Nazi commander had not placed those people there by accident. He had put them in the path of danger because he thought their fear would protect him. But now the Americans understood the shape of the trap. Infantry moved from cover to cover. One group kept the German positions pinned. Another worked to pull civilians away from the open road. Soldiers shouted directions over the sound of gunfire. Smoke and dust rolled through the street. Nobody knew if the Germans would fire into their own civilians just to keep the trap working. A tank turned its turret toward a building where shots had come from, but it held fire for a moment. Civilians were still too close. Instead, American soldiers moved nearer, using the tank for cover. It was slow, dangerous work, the kind of fighting that never looks clean on a map. On a map, an arrow moves forward and a town changes hands. But on the ground, that arrow is a soldier deciding whether to shoot, while a frightened child is only yards away. Little by little, the civilians were pulled out of the most dangerous area. Some crawled behind walls. Some ran when American soldiers waved them forward. Some stayed frozen until they were dragged or guided away. Every civilian who reached cover made the German commander's position weaker. And once the civilians were no longer standing directly in front of the American advance, everything changed. The German troops were exposed. The commander had counted on hesitation, but Patton's men had not stayed frozen. They had adapted. They had moved around the trap. They had protected the civilians as much as they could and kept coming. Now the American fire became more focused. Buildings suspected of holding German soldiers were surrounded. Streets were cleared section by section. Any German position that kept fighting was answered. Any soldier who surrendered was taken. Inside the town, the commander's control began to collapse. The civilians were no longer blocking the road. His men could see the Americans moving closer. What was meant to slow Patton's advance had only revealed how desperate the defense had become. As the Americans pushed deeper, civilians began appearing from cellars, doorways, and damaged homes. Some carried white cloths. Some kept both hands in the air. Some looked afraid of everyone, the German soldiers who had forced them into danger, and the American soldiers now entering their streets. One woman held her child tightly, still shaking. An old man kept saying he had no weapon. Another civilian pointed toward the buildings where German soldiers had been firing. The town itself seemed to turn against the commander's plan. Then came the moment he had tried to avoid. The commander had to face the Americans without the civilians in front of him. He had believed innocent people would protect him. He had believed Patton's men would stop and give him time. But now the streets were being cleared, his soldiers were surrendering or being pushed back, and the civilians he had used were standing on the side of the road, alive, shaken, and watching his power disappear. The confrontation did not need a long speech. The scene said enough. The commander who had hidden behind families now stood exposed. For the American soldiers, this was more than another captured town. It was a reminder of how ugly the final months had become. Towns looked quiet but could hide snipers. Civilians looked helpless but could be trapped inside military plans they never chose. But this tactic had not worked. A commander who uses civilians as protection is not powerful. He is already losing. The Nazi commander thought innocent people could become his last defense. But when Patton's men kept coming, the truth became clear. The civilians were not his shield. They were his witnesses. Subscribe for more WWII documentary stories about battlefield justice, forgotten moments, and the human choices that shaped history.